So we have a couple questions here too, Michael. So while
Okay.
we're looking for the next pictures, what is the best way to clean your mortar? If there are gaps in the mortar, how should you repair it?
As far as pointing and cleaning, you should probably do all your pointing first. You should rake out any mortar mechanically with a putty knife or I use a tuck pointing trowel that's gotten broken off, and there are some other tools made for that. This iron bar is one of them. And you hold on to, you put either end into the mortar joint and rake out as much loose stuff as you can get, and then brush it out or flush it out with a hose.
So how difficult is that, or would you be using both hands too?
You'd be using both hands. Yeah, it's a physical job. Now, they do make, you could use a grinder, you could grind that out, but you should definitely wear a dust mask and preferably capture all the dust with a HEPA vac or something like that to protect yourself, and wear safety glasses as well.
And I guess, and depending upon the stones, so something like sandstone that's a lot more soft than limestone, you need to be careful about using mechanical.
It is, you don't want to cut anything erroneously or gouge anything. You have to do any repairs. After you rake everything out and clean it out good, you make up your mortar, historic mortar mixture, which the formula is available at the Eastro design review guidelines.
So that's funny you should ask that, because you should say that, because that's our next question, which is how do I find or mix the right mortar for my wall?
Okay, well, the design review guidelines give a formula, which is, it makes a lot of mortar, 5 gallons of lime, 5 gallons of sand, 10 gallons of sand, and 4 cups of Portland cement. Now, what I do is I try to get a sand that's a good buff color and is kind of to match the old mortars, and is not a fine sand, but a coarse sand that has a little bigger aggregate, because it also affects the color. And I use, I use white Portland cement instead of gray Portland cement. I don't want to tint the color off too gray, because a lot of the mortars started out as almost white and they just turned to a buff color over time. And then I use a dry powder tinning color. Rainbow is one brand, but any kind of dry color for tinning concrete, and look for a buff color and add that to the mix and mix it all up dry. I use a regular mixer for plaster and mix everything dry until I get it to a good color that looks good, even dry. And then I use that to point with. So, but you need to thoroughly mix everything dry.
So, but are all those materials that you talked about readily available within our area?
Oh, yes. Any masonry supply, they'll have the dry colors, they'll have hydrated lime, they'll have coarse sand usually. So but a lot of mason supplies only carry fine sand, but places like L&W Supply that supply for stucco and things like that will have a coarse sand that you can use.
And isn't it true that the guidelines for the type of the right mortar mix are based upon standards put out by the National Park Service? So any of the local historic districts should be able to
provide something. The well might be slightly different, but they're along those lines.
So earlier today, we saw a presentation about how absolutely important it is to use the right mortar for bricks.
Yes.
Because of the damage that can be done. Does that apply when you're dealing with stone as well?
It does. You should use the same kind of lime mortar, appropriate mortar that has like a thermal coefficient, like I said, that will keep it from. If you use a really hard mortar, it's not going to allow the stone to expand and contract. You're going to get breakage along the edges. It'll break the mortar out. The other thing mortar does is a lot of mortars are permeable, or at least the lime mortars are permeable, and they can let moisture out, whereas Portland cement or modern mortars just won't do that, and they trap some moisture inside of there.
I have heard people tell me before that lime mortar is like a living mortar, is that that especially if you use it on stone that already has calcium carbonate and some of those other
Yeah.
things, that they will actually bond together.
And it turns back to limestone eventually. So
That's really
All
fascinating.
of it.
That's really interesting.
yeah, with
So-
the additions of carbon.
So we have a couple more questions. If you don't mind me, go ahead and fielding them to you.
Go ahead.
Here's a question about removing paint from a stone wall. What's the proper way and maybe even the improper way?
There's no easy way to do that, and no non-toxic way that I know of. Stone is usually so porous that the paint is really going to get in there, and pressure washing isn't a good idea. You know, you would have to use, the few times I've seen it done, a chemical process was used, which caused a huge toxic cleanup. It did produce some decent results, but most historic districts and most places won't allow you to do it because of the potential damage to the environment. And it's not a good idea anyway. So there's not really any easy way to get it off the stone. So as the wall behind us has been plastered and painted and everything else, and the best thing to do is to let it wear off. You know, take it off with a brush or something like that. You
But
can use
not too abrasive, correct?
No, a wire brush and scrape
Yeah.
what is loose, and eventually most of it will come off.
Yeah. So the wall behind us, it just, for those that are watching us out there, was dates to 1893. So,
Right.
And is in a lower level and actually endured the 1937 flood and probably a few more before that. So,
The previous question, one of the previous questions, I get back to maybe, is for cleaning things after you've pointed. And there are a variety of chemical cleaners. There are mild acids, which will clean all of that sloppy mortar and old stuff off of there, but you want to use them sparingly and diluted. You can use really strong vinegar and it'll clean things really well.
oh, really?
Mhm.
So, so where would you find a vinegar that strength? We're not talking Kroger vinegar, right?
No, I don't know where, you know, the company I work for ordered that, a big pallet.
Right.
We've got just a really strong vinegar, so.
So probably those could probably at least order.
Maybe they'll also try to sell you the milder acids that aren't bad. They're very good, but mild muriatic acid will work. So you just don't want to have it too strong and do too much damage. Because
Probably not something for a lay person to try and
No.
put together.
you know, in all things, hire a professional.
Yeah.
If nothing else, to get some instruction and guidance.
We also have a question from Tim, who said our front stoop is made of sandstone. It's inside the alcove. The top is spalling. Is there a way to patch that?
They do. There's a company called Conproco, which makes limestone and masonry repair materials, and they make a repair material called matrix, and it comes in assorted colors, and you can also add tinting colors to that to get to the place that you want. And they have a specific process for that, which you can research online for getting it the right consistency and doing a slurry coat before you do the actual patch, and then letting that kind of set up and get green to where it's not set up or it's hard, but where it's green, and then you can cut that back to achieve the profile that you want.
So by green, you mean?
Not hardened, not quite hardened yet.
So how much time would that be?
In a hot summer day, it might be 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and other times it might be an hour before you can sculpt it successfully without
digging
tearing it
it
all off.
Yeah, okay. I think that answers that question. Do we want to go back to a few more of the photographs that you have?
We can go to go to number 4, if you could. That's just the other thing to speak on was concrete walls, which are just, modern day versions of the stone walls. So this is this is on York Street. I did all my photography on York Street at the same time of the day. And concrete walls have their own set of problems. Now this wall was probably built when the church was built, which is on the corner there. I think that's probably early 1900s, maybe up to 1920 for that little addition there. But that's good and plumb. They did a good job, done a good job, whoever did it. And concrete walls present a little different set of problems in that they have the same problems that stone walls have with the addition of the other structural problems that can happen with concrete, like aggregates. If the concrete wall, since it's formed, and many of the walls early on, for appearance, they were stuccoed over. So again, CO2 will attack that paste and it'll eventually spall off, or you'll have adhesion problems. The other things are mechanical, like if it wasn't, you poured the concrete and they didn't use vibrators then, so they would rod it. They would push a piece of rebar rod down in there to try to get everything filled well. And if that doesn't work right, you'll have voids, and that can cause expansion and contraction problems later, and this surface covering will break off. The aggregate can be contaminated by additions when it was poured, and or there can be metal in it, and that can expand and contract and cause staining and erosion and breakage of the concrete.
So by additions, when it was poured, you're not referring to Newport Sin City days where people used to get a Newport
Put people
90
in there? No,
get encased in it.
but they put a lot of bulk in there to make the concrete cheaper, like cinders and pieces of metal can get in there, chunks of brick.
The two of us actually saw over at the old Green Derby site where somebody had actually done that. We didn't. Do you remember some of the things that we identified that were in that wall?
Yeah, they'd fill it up with anything to bulk it up.
We saw some bottles, a saw blade, just a number of things just to try and add that bulk. And would that be done, I guess, just to save on pouring more concrete?
Yeah. I think that was a case where they had a spot in between two walls that they put concrete in, that they just needed to fill it up so they could just put some concrete on the top, which never works.
Right.
They tried it, so saved it for us to see. Some of the other, one of the other problems that can happen with concrete walls, besides the few I just delineated, is, could you give me number 12? So now this isn't a wall, but it's a ceiling that I was working on. It's actually a ceiling on a balcony. So it's the bottom of the next floor's balcony. And unreinforced concrete isn't that common, but reinforced concrete is. And if the reinforcing bars start to rust, they actually expand, and they'll eventually break the concrete. And these two bars here that you can see, now that was on a ceiling, and I got up there we were going to repair that ceiling because it was cracked around the edges. And when I put my pry bar under it, that fell down, and it held on by the caulk bead that was running along the top of the trim.
So what we see on the wall is actually
used to be up underneath the ceiling.
Oh, and it held there long enough to get a photograph.
Yeah, I had to cut it down. Yeah.
Oh.
It didn't fall.
That's some strong caulk.
And that's one of the problems with if rebar is too close to the surface, or the surface above accepts too much water, like you don't use a water repellent on it or paint the concrete, then water gets through there, and also old time rebar, they didn't coat it like they do today. Now rebar is epoxy coated, and our solution here is to grind everything back on the steel and put an epoxy coating on it, and then do a structural repair material over that to make that flush.
So you grind it back to get to fresh metal.
Yeah, to get so that the epoxy. Well, what we use is a core converter, a rust converter, and an epoxy coating, which covers everything up, and the rust can't happen again.
Well, how in the heck did it even get rusted inside of a concrete
The
ceiling?
concrete itself reacts with the concrete's wet, and all the other chemicals in the concrete react with the steel.
And it eventually leaches to the steel bar.
Yeah, and it's a common problem. What happens here is that was just a little bit too close to the surface of the concrete. So if you do put any rebar in, when we do any rebar work and we're going to repair anything, we want at least an inch of depth concrete cover over any rebar, which isn't always the case depending on who put it in. Like I said, workmanship is a big deal. So that's another thing that can happen with concrete.
So how old do you think this material, this ceiling was?
That building was built in the 1960s.
Okay.
But I spent literally 4 months there repairing balcony ceilings and balcony floors because of the rust jacking from the.
Wow.
So we did 200 units or something like that. So.
Even though 1960s makes a building eligible for National Register listing for historic preservation,
Yeah,
it does not really seem all that long ago.
You know, and you're 50, 60 years, whereas the stone walls we were looking at were 130 years old.
And still relatively sound and not any of these type of problems.
And that's just a really good visual example. You know,
That's a great visual.
It can happen. Sometimes you'll just get a spall in the middle of a wall, and it's because there's a bolt or something or a piece of rebar that's too close to the, in which case you got to jackhammer it out and grind the metal back and put a rust converter on there and then go ahead and do your repairs.
Wow.
It should be viable then for a while, 20 years or so.
That definitely sounds like a job that a professional should be doing, not a homeowner.
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough. Masonry is a little specialized for, although a lot of it's just grunt work, laying walls, just, you do need the basics, you know, Mr. Level and Mr. Plum.
Good friends to have.
As many stones as you're gonna lay, on a stone wall, you're gonna need at least 4 or 5 shims. So you need a bunch of chips of rock to shim the rock up, you know, to help with holding. The mortar might not necessarily hold it up, so shim it up so till the mortar can set.
So that's an old technique also, correct? Because the stones don't just come nice and
They don't come cut
nice
and
and
flat.
square
No,
and flat.
no, not natural stone. They're all different thicknesses, and you gotta kind of make that work.
So while we're talking about those walls, before we move on to the next slide, we see on York Street and York Street and some of the cross streets and on Washington, some of these old stone walls that are throughout the city. What do those, at least in Newport, how far back do those date as far as construction is concerned?
Well, retaining stone walls, retaining walls, all that stuff was built as soon as the city's hardscapes went in, as soon as any infrastructure went in.
So in a city as old as Newport, for 225 years,
Yeah,
many of those may have been just part because of to work with the topography of the
right.
community.
Yeah, to retain the wall and sculpt the streets. And yeah, it's always an issue. So, I don't have much information on Newport, but I know that, like I said, downtown Cincinnati, they were importing stone, and I'm sure they were building walls by the 18 teens, you know, to go up the hill to 4th Street. So, because the bottoms were built in first.
Well, and Cincinnati is certainly a much hillier
Yeah.
area than Northern Kentucky is. Do we want to move on to the next slide then?
We do. The only other thing for concrete is efflorescence, which is difficult to remove, but a lot of times it's a contamination inside the concrete for efflorescence. Stone is not such a big deal. You can usually just brush it with a wire brush, flush it with water, and that will usually take care of it for a long time.
So explain a little bit about what efflorescence actually is.
Efflorescence are chemicals that are usually in concrete, potassium and calcium and other things that are leaching. You're having a reaction inside that concrete where it looks really bad, the most problem areas, and it's leaching out. It's that moisture's getting out.
And is that's part of the composition of concrete, or is it because that the aggregate is contributing?
The aggregate, it is part of the composition of the concrete. So when the aggregates have reactions to each other, it can cause efflorescence. So it's almost impossible to get rid of. So,
No.
Because it will continue to react as long as what you can do is if you get the efflorescence is just what's drying on the surface from water that's leaching out. So if you can clean it all off and it'll look fine for a while, but sooner or later more moisture comes out, water runs down the wall, it dries, and you can see this.
So that's an indication of something else happening.
Right. So you're getting moisture into the wall somewhere. If you can stop that and clean things up, it might go away.
So it could be coming from a roof, it could be coming from the other side of the wall.
Usually a wall has, concrete walls are different, but all stone walls usually have a coping on top, another piece of stone, a flat piece of stone that prevents water from going down the interior of the wall, which would cause all kinds of problems. Brick walls are the same way. In a house, you have a top plate or whatever. But concrete walls, it's difficult to say. Sometimes we've had to, in my profession, we've had to add metal coping to the top of a concrete wall to prevent water penetration down through the wall so that we can do our repairs on the vertical part of the wall and not have them reappear. So,
great, thank you.
Okay, so we're kind of done with concrete.
So while we're waiting for actually, if you want to indicate your next slide, but while we're waiting for that to come up, I do have a question. So why don't you indicate which one you want next?
Number 13.
So on concrete walls, you mentioned sealing, and you also mentioned painting. Kind of explain, I think everyone knows the difference between those two, but the benefits and maybe perhaps the detriment of doing either one of those things to a concrete wall.
Well, concrete is different than, concrete isn't really made to breathe. So, but it is good, it does breathe, but it's not like a stone wall where it's very important that the mortar and the stone can breathe, and water, vapor can get out through the mortar and not through the stone or the brick and not impact the brick. The brick's just a big sponge at some point. And if water vapor will go right through the wall no matter what you do. So,
yeah.
The house construction now is you make this vapor barrier. The whole inside of the house is a separate environment. But old time, the plaster walls here in Newport, you have bricks plaster right on the brick inside, and you can put what we used to use was tar paper, which was roll roofing or whatever, and you use that as a moisture retarder to slow the moisture down that's coming through the wall, but you'll never stop it. It's going to go through. Water vapor will go through. So when you paint the outside of the wall of a brick wall, that causes problems because water vapor can't move back and forth. It'll trap in the brick. You'll damage the brick. Eventually, it'll blister the paint. A lot of problems. Concrete's a little different in that you can totally paint the concrete wall and encapsulate it, and you really aren't going to have much more of a problem. Other things used, which we use on brick sometimes, I know it's not always from a restoration standpoint kosher, but
then don't tell us. No, go ahead.
Our water repellents, which they aren't the old time Thompson's water seal, which was silicone, but they're a breathable water repellent. And there are a lot of different kinds, and there's a lot of good technology now, which still allows things to breathe, but it prevents definitely any kind of water penetration. So
that really is preservation friendly, though, because
it is, and
it still allows the walls to function as it did before,
right,
but add some layer of protection.
And we've done big limestone, that's an end of Ohio. We cleaned the whole building, cleaned all the limestone sills, cleaned some of those, and some of them were limestone walls. And then we put a water repellent on everything. And then what you do to warranty that is you come back later after you've done all your water count and everything's dry. You put a little cup on the wall and seal it in with some plumber's putty, and it's got a tube on it, and you pour a measured amount of water in there, and you come back.
Oh.
12 hours later, 5 hours later, 6 hours later, and you see what kind of absorption rate you have. So, and that prevents water from running through. It won't really prevent water vapor, from getting in and out, but it'll prevent any water penetration from causing
an actual liquid stream of some sort.
So, and you want that to be minimal. So it doesn't have to be zero, probably never be zero. You want it to be very minimal.
All right, well, let's move on to the slide that's here.
Okay,
Because
well, we're moving on to iron fences. So I don't know what happened over there.
Well,
Which was
there we
number
are.
13. So,
yeah, there we are.
okay. So iron fences was the other thing, which are another, I guess they replaced stone fences. So for the urban.
And sometimes we see hybrids too, right?
Yeah. And a lot of times iron fences are set in sandstone or limestone, not necessarily concrete. Sometimes they're set right in the ground like this. This is just a generic iron fence look. So, and that's again on York Street. We could go to number 14. That's another iron fence that's set in a cut sandstone step detail. It's on Overton Street in Newport. It's the classic Newport look. I think isn't the logo made?
Yes.
From something like that.
Yes.
So.
But this is an interesting piece to show also. It is an iron fence. We've moved on to talk about the fences, but it is set in the limestone.
It is.
So some of the issues that we talked about before could very well happen in this particular case.
Right.
As far as rust and creating issues. How do you prevent that water from penetrating in? Is it,
well,
should you?
These particular, usually on fences like this where they're set in limestone or stone, they're set in lead. So they were, the stone was cut and put in place. They cut a hole in it, or it was already cut. They built the fence, and the fence post, which is usually like a 1-inch square, fit down in that. They get everything level and plumb, and then they pour hot lead around the base of that up to the top of the stone.
Kind of like an anchor.
Yeah, and it keeps water from getting in. It keeps the thing from rusting, so you don't rust off at the base.
So the lead prevents the rust underneath.
Yes, yeah, it'll lock everything in. In fact, you'll play hell getting it out. So, you can't really heat it up enough to get it out usually. So you got to drill it out.
And as one of the extreme benefits of lead is the fact that lead really does not rot.
It's pretty inert.
Yeah, and so it doesn't corrode, and that's why it's been used for many times for roofing materials and other things, is because of the durability.
All the traps, all the lead service lines are still in place, unfortunately.
Yes, not to scare anybody, but there are some running under your city, no matter which city you're in, which of our 3 cities you're in. So, but all of this fence work, all this decorative work that we see, we're talking about the 19th century. So we're talking about fencing that was formed.
These are wrought iron. There's no welding on it. They were made by a blacksmith or a machine, Bucher Ironworks and Stewart Ironworks are 2 companies that you see tags for a lot of in this city. So Stewart Ironworks is in Covington, but Bucher Ironworks was started in 1858 on 6th Street in Newport, and they were there until I was still working in the 1980s. So
Yeah.
I used to go there and have things welded. So.
Wow.
But they're just heated up and banged into place and formed, and you can actually take them apart if you want to take the time to pry on things and bang it around. You can disassemble.
Does that make it easier for repairs?
It does in some ways. In fact, we'll get to another slide here soon. In fact, let's go on to well, let's go to number 15 and 16. 15. So there we go. So this is a common problem with, this is another iron fence, just a hoop and spear fence that because it wasn't, maintained properly and painted, we got some rusting out at that little clip that holds things on there. Now those clips, a lot of that stuff is available for replacement parts. So when I redo a fence, if it's in the customer's budget, I take everything apart. Usually they're just set in concrete in the ground. Sometimes we don't take the post out if it's good and sturdy and it's not rusted bad at the bottom, clean and paint the post in place. We'll take the fence sections out and apart and repair all the pieces and clips and make new things that we need to. And then take that and have it lightly sandblasted, all the fence sections. And if you really want to go the extra mile, you can have it galvanized, which people do with a lot of new fence manufacturers do. But if not, you can have it sandblasted and then powder coated, which is what I usually do. And then just use all new stainless steel fasteners when you put it back together and take those.
So powder coating, explain a little bit what that actually is. It's not just paint, right?
Well, no, it's a paint coating that's baked on, so it's kind of a baked enamel finish.
Oh, okay.
So, I'm not sure what all the proprietary compositions of the powder are, but
so do they actually like spray it on and then like bake it?
they spray it on and they bake it in them. Yeah.
Wow, interesting.
So, and find in some place, there's actually a place in Newport called Leonard's Powder Coating that has a big enough oven and they work with a guy who will sandblast it and not destroy it, which is hard to find. And he'll lightly blast it and send it. I usually take it and do all the repairs first and then send it to them to blast everything.
So this piece that we're looking at here that's deteriorated, is that something that is repairable the way that it is, or does it make just more sense to replace that little clip?
I'd replace that clip. If we can go on to number 16. Now at the bottom of this picture, these clips have been replaced, it looks like, on the top, or been at least rebolted, but the bottom is completely eroded, and the rail that all the hoops and spears go through is gone. So in an instance like that, I would salvage any usable clips and things, but I would cut out a section of that rail. Now, the problem being that unless you have some old fence to choose from, a lot of the new replacement parts aren't the same dimension as the old channels and things that they use for their rails. So I'd always pick up junk stuff whenever I can to facilitate repairs. So I can get the same dimension. That way I can cut a piece off down there and weld it back together and grind that weld smooth and have it powder coated. And then you're back in business.
Make it nearly invisible repair.
Right.
So you're talking about picking up, that it's something that unfortunately we still see these coming out.
Oh, I know. It's heartbreaking.
Yeah. I want to ask you about a fence that was done that you did across the street from me. Tell us where that fence was before you got a hold of it.
Oh, it wasn't the fence so much, it was the gate. I redid a gate for somebody, and unfortunately I looked for a picture of it, I didn't have a picture of it.
Yeah.
So I couldn't get by there to get a picture. I redid a fence for Scott's neighbor, Kathy Kettering, and she had a gate which was it was damaged kind of badly. One of the parts of the bottom corner of the gate were broken and it was bent, and it was bent because she had a concrete driveway pad when she moved in, and when they jackhammered it out, they found the fence gate being used as like a reinforcing bar. They just threw it in the hole there and concreted over it. It actually came out in pretty good shape.
Yeah.
And I was able to salvage it. I straightened everything and it looks like a new gate now, so.
That's amazing.
I had to cut out one corner of it and replace a bottom corner, which had been too badly damaged. But I welded all that back.
But again, that's the ability to be able to pull off of.
And I had some other gates that I could get parts from.
Yeah.
So I always pick up stuff whenever I can.
So it's kind of like doing a classic car. You're always looking for pieces of it, put it all back together.
Right. So number 17. 3 minutes.
Yep.
Oh, okay. Okay, we'll get through here quickly then. Actually, can we go to number 18? Okay, so this is the gate on Park Avenue in Newport and a fence. And the homeowner brought me 9 sections of fence and he wanted a fence around his. He didn't have any gates, but he had plenty of fence. So I took the fence sections and banged them apart, or at least cut part sections of them, and made the outside hoop for a gate. And so I manufactured that gate from the middle of a fence section.
Oh.
And I did that with 2. There's another gate on the other side, which it has a different profile and it has a more oval curve. So, but that shows what you can do if you can find the salvage material. You can put an original gate fence back in. Now, some of the finials I had to buy and salvage finials. I had to buy finials for the posts, replacement finials, but I was able to salvage enough finials on the spears that they all matched them.
Oh, great.
Okay. Okay, one more, number 19. So. Okay, now this is another, I didn't do this. I'm pretty sure that Ellesmere Ironworks did this work. This is on 8th Street in Newport. And this is a brand new fence and gate, which was built by them. They do impeccable work. And they do go to the extra mile. They build everything. They clean it all. They send it out and have it galvanized. Then they send it out and have it powder coated. So it's, long-term, a long-term deal. So, and that they did a pretty good job on matching a historic profile. So, on the other end of the yard, there is an older Stewart Ironworks gate, which they took and repaired, squared up, and sent it out and had everything else done to it too. So it matches, but it's got a Stewart Ironworks medallion.
So as a choice, I'm guessing that iron fences, as that technology and as the company started manufacturing them, they really did take the place of the stone walls because it's a great way to define your property.
Yeah, and stone walls are a little more rural. They call them stone fences.
Right, right. Many of those, I understand, were actually put together without any mortar at all.
No, they're just stacked.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're stacked, like leaning up against each other, not necessarily horizontally. So
they seem to have an awful lot of stone in central Kentucky. To be
it's everywhere. The limestone gets older and thicker as we go south. The same kind of limestone shelves in that whole Penny Round, whatever, the middle of Kentucky. And the limestone disappears as an anticline. It slopes downward to the north.
So one last question, and then we're going to finish this session for today, and we'll have more sessions tomorrow, starting at 11 o'clock. So check your Zoom links and check the schedule on our website. But first of all, Mike, I want to thank you for doing this. Mike is an incredible craftsman that pretty much can deal in just about any aspect of preservation. And not only has a great deal of knowledge, as you can tell, but he's certainly has personality to be able to deal with the homeowners and help them. So we appreciate you helping us out here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And your company again?
I do work for myself on the side. My contact information is in the bio, but I work for a company called Wrought Restoration. We do mostly commercial work and high, big buildings, swing stage work.
So most of your preservation work that you do is on your own company.
Yeah, restoration, we do a lot of work in historic districts for Wrought Restoration, but yeah, I've done more on my own than and all the wood graining and marble and other things I've done on my own.
Okay, so I want to remind everybody at home that this session was being taped. And so all of the sessions for this weekend will be made available sometime in the near future for viewing, to be able to, in case you missed a session, or we've seen this in other sessions. Mike mentioned some different companies. They mentioned some different materials. So if anyone ever wants to, if you want to go back and get some reference, you'll be able to do that. So look for that to come up. We're also planning some hands-on preservation programs that will be coming up probably mid to late summer, so that people can actually try their hand at some of these things we've discussed. So thank you all very much for broadcasting or producing from the Southgate Street School. We appreciate you tuning in today, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thank you.